Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ryan, and welcome to Central Park. Thanks for your patience as we start up another version of our weekly walks, which occur every Wednesday at 12:30, helping to bring the park directly to you from wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for your continued support here at the Central Park Conservancy. Today, we're going to be taking a weekly walk titled April Fools with me, Ryan, on April 5th, 2023. Now, I know we're a little bit late for April Fool's Day, but we wanted to help celebrate this foolish little holiday by combining our love for Central Park with our love for some pranks and jokes. So on our walk today, you are going to hear some fabricated stories, as well as some very authentic stories. Good luck deciphering which is which. I will let you know after I've mentioned them what is fact and what is fiction. But for those who are joining us late, you might be a little bit confused. But as we move through the park today, I want to thank you again for helping to keep the park looking clean and green by supporting us at the Central Park Conservancy, whose mission is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and the well-being of all. Now, as we make our way through the park today, I know many of you are very in tuned with Zoom and know how to work it. We do have a chat feature if you'd like to use that to say hello. And I do want to mention to everybody about the chat feature. I know some people don't realize that you can turn the chat feature off. If you do not want to see the chat, simply go to the chat box, typically on your right-hand side of the screen, and click the little arrow to close out the chat. If you don't want to see the little pop-ups of comments, you can actually scroll down to the chat feature, which is the red circle in the center of this photo. And directly next to the word chat, you'll see a small arrow. Clicking that arrow, you can uncheck the box, which says to show chat previews. If you close the chat box and uncheck that, you will not see anything chat related. Again, you have the option to turn off captions as well. So please feel free to use that exercise that ability to turn off the chat or the captions if you do not wish to see them. Otherwise, they will be active for those who'd like to participate in them. For those who do want to participate, you're going to have a lot of opportunity today because I do have a few polls that are directly related to a little bit of a guessing game that we're going to see later. And of course, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A feature. Just about all of my colleagues are on the back end today answering any questions you might have. And as you may have heard, there might be a few questions asked because we're going to talk a little bit about some kind of foolish stories here in Central Park. We do have a little walking portion of our walk today, as well as a little guessing game I mentioned at the end, which we'll go over in just a little while. But for now, let's start this April Fool's walk down at Grand Army Plaza. Wait a second. That's the wrong Grand Army Plaza. This is Grand Army Plaza over in Brooklyn, near Prospect Park, another park designed by Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. You might notice some general similarities. It was designed by them in 1867. It was really meant to serve the same purpose as the Grand Army Plaza over near Central Park, to separate the noisy city from the much more serene park that lies just beyond it. We see their original design looking a little bit different though, including primarily a fountain known as the Fountain of Golden Spray, also nicknamed the Bailey Fountain, as we might better know it today. The feature that we see that's most prominent in the Grand Army Plaza area today is, of course, that large arch which helps to welcome people into the park. This photo gives us an idea of what we might have seen back around 1891 or so as we were entering Prospect Park over in Brooklyn. That Soldiers and Sailors Arch, as it's known, was created between 1889 and 1892. And Vaux and Olmsted, they didn't really want large fixtures like this to welcome people into the park. However, of course, a lot of adaptation would come to their parks and landscapes in the following decades and even centuries. This Soldier and Sailors Arch would open around 1892. And it does, as you might have guessed, represent some of the various soldiers that served in the Union Army. And it's kind of appropriate that we have a war memorial here because there was actually a major battle to occur in this area. In fact, the first major battle of the Revolutionary War was to take place right over here. It was known as the Battle of Long Island. That would actually be the first battle to occur after the Declaration of Independence became more publicized. We do see a very fitting war memorial over here. We can see again that being completed around 1892, but not being in Vox and Olmsted's original intended plan for this traffic circle area. If we snack back to Manhattan, we can visit the Grand Army Plaza we might be more familiar with, the one that helps to welcome us into Central Park, found down near 59th Street and 5th Avenue. Now, this was another traffic circle designed by Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. Of course, theirs was a little bit more simple as they primarily focused on a circle featuring a lot of trees and no large monuments. But of course, it wouldn't be long before we see suggestions for elaborate monuments and arches and things like that making their way into the park. In 1903, we would see the William Tecumseh Sherman statue, which we can see pictured here, being dedicated. Interestingly enough, we do see this location before that not really being known as Grand Army Plaza. We see the monument being dedicated on Memorial Day. That holiday was actually established by a Union veterans group called the Grand Army of the Republic. After that, these areas would soon become known as Grand Army Plaza, which we still refer to them as today. We'd see this area changing up a little bit because when Pulitzer Fountain was added in 1916, the architect who designed it, Carl Bitter, redesigned the area to include two fountains, or two plaza areas rather. So we do have this William Tecumseh Sherman area, as well as the Pulitzer Fountain and Plaza located a little south of here. We're going to start entering the park now, and we're of course going to talk a little bit about some of the April Fool's pranks related to the park and other fun stories connected to New York City and the holiday. Now, to start, let's talk a little bit about the origins of where April Fools really came from. Now, it's still under a lot of speculation, but some historians believe that April Fool's Day dates back to about 1582, back during that time when France switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. And we do see that switch confusing a lot of people. In the Julian calendar, as in the Hindu calendar, the new year actually began on the spring equinox around April 1st. People who were slow to get the news continued to celebrate it during the last week of March through April. They would become the butt of jokes, so to speak, and these hoaxes or these people referred to as April Fools. The pranks that we initially see coming, being a little bit more lighthearted, included having paper fish placed on people's backs. This would refer to as poisson d'avril in French, which translates to April fish. And it was said to symbolize a young, easily caught fish or a gullible person. That's where we see a lot of these origins starting. Believe that the holiday spread throughout areas of Britain and Scotland towards the 18th century, eventually working their way over to America. And as we make our way a little bit further into the park, we can see how there were a few pranks revolving around April Fools here in New York City, and more specifically, Central Park. As we walk just a little bit up the path through Doris C. Friedman Plaza, we can make our way to the Central Park Zoo. And as we look around the zoo, of course, there's a lot of lighthearted fun to enjoy. One of the favorite exhibits, of course, being the sea lions that we can see right in the center of the zoo area. These sea lions look like they're about ready to jump out and maybe even escape from the zoo. Now, not too many animals have escaped from the zoo, but there was a little bit of a prank revolving around the zoo back during the 19th century. Now, in the 1870s, there was a paper known as the New York Herald, which was one of the more widely read and influential newspapers in the world. It had actually won international acclaim not too long before that, before really financing Henry Stanley's successful quest to find Dr. David Livingstone in the interior of Africa. Stories like this helped to put the paper on the map, but that success was followed by some rather interesting pranks, so to speak. On November 9th, 1874, interestingly enough, not even around April Fools, we see the paper publishing a front page article that claims that the animals from the Central Park Zoo have escaped and were rampaging through the city. Now, it sounds a little lighthearted, We even see some future papers like this one coming from Harper's Weekly, which illustrated the described actions in the New York Herald's text, showing again these rampaging animals. That was a little lighthearted, but some of the lines read that a lion had been seen inside a church, a rhinoceros had fallen into a sewer, and that the police and the National Guard were heroically battling against the beast, but already 49 people were dead and 200 were injured. We can see not so lighthearted of a joke here. It described it as a bloody and fearful carnival. And most people might not have gotten to the end, where in very small fine print, it read that this story was entirely a fabrication. It did cause a little bit of panic, similar to the War of the Worlds by Orson Welles that we see coming during the radio broadcasting era. But some of these jokes, of course, revolving around the zoo, almost have a way of kind of repeating themselves. Some of you may be familiar that the zoo recently had an escapee. After some vandalization occurred to one of the zoo exhibits, we do see an animal escaping. And this is not an April Fool's joke, but rather the true story of Flacco, the Eurasian eagle owl, who is now found roaming around Central Park. Multiple attempts were conducted to try to recapture Flacco, as we can see here, as he approaches a baited rat trap. But these attempts had no success, and Flacco is still wandering around the park. There's actually not sure if he's going to be here to stay or if there are going to be attempts to recapture him. But at the moment, it looks like one of the zoo's residents is no longer a resident, but rather just a visitor. Is keeping a nearby distance to the zoo, though. So keep your eyes out in Central Park, and you can see this 19th century animal escapee story really coming to life in present day. As we make our way past the zoo, we'll continue up a little bit, and we'll enjoy a few other little jokes along the way. Now, as we make our way heading a little west now, we can start to walk over the Gap-style bridge. Now, as we make our way a little bit further in, we can reminisce about all the wildlife spottings we can see in the park. A lot of them happening in woodlands like the Northwoods, the Ramble, or the Howlett Nature Sanctuary, which is pictured here. Now, the Howlett Nature Sanctuary has some fences around it, and you may be wondering, why are there fences around this woodland? And that's because this woodland has changed up a lot over time. Initially, it wasn't even a woodland, but rather a pretty landscape to view as you would walk around the water body, the pond. We would eventually see it being closed off to the public in the 20th century, and eventually reopened to the public in the 21st century. This area, though, did contain some interesting wildlife at one point or another. Now, one thing that's pretty interesting to consider is that New York used to have a lot of beaver colonies. They were very abundant in pre-colonial New York City, and beaver were actually one of the main reasons that New York City's population grew. The fur trade that this wildlife provided led to a lot of economic business here. And we do see these creatures unfortunately being overhunted over time, leading to almost an entirely absent population here today. Now, there are other stories about wildlife making triumphant comebacks. And of course, here in Central Park, we're certainly trying to support that. Now, when the gray wolf was reintroduced to the Yellowstone area and ecosystem back in the 1990s, there was only one beaver colony that was in the park, reported by Doug Smith, a wildlife biologist. But after that, after about a decade or two, today we're seeing upwards of 9 beaver colonies existing in Yellowstone Park, thanks to the reintroduction of these wolves. So we can see really a great ripple of direct and indirect consequences throughout the ecosystem, thanks to these wolves. Following the success of this Yellowstone story, the New York City Parks Department, along with the Department of Environmental Conservation, teamed up with the Central Park Conservancy to release a pack of gray wolves into Central Park in the early 2000s. They would be stored initially in the Howlett Nature Sanctuary, which is why we see those gates around there. The wolves are brought in to not only increase beaver populations, but also to hunt some of the rodents and pests that we can see running all around the park. They would be chained up and locked up inside of the Howlett during the day, offering an almost zoo-like exhibit, where at night they would be released into the park to hunt rodents, eventually being corralled back into the Howlett Nature Sanctuary by a group of wolf herding dogs that was stored at the arsenal down near the Central Park Zoo. These wolves provided a wonderful method of rat catching, as well as, again, wildlife spottings to see. As walking around the pond, we could capture views like this of the wolves roaming free. April Fools, of course, there were not wolves released in Central Park. In fact, the Hallett Nature Sanctuary has gates just to close it off from people rather than to keep wildlife locked in. So while you may not ever see a wolf here in Central Park, you can see something close. Now, this is not an April Fool's joke. The photo you see here is not of a dog in Central Park, but rather an animal pretty closely related to a wolf, a coyote. Now, it's not clear how many coyotes might be in the park right now, but there is theorized to be at least one or two. Again, this is no April Fool's joke, as coyotes have actually had a relatively regular presence here in Central Park for some time. In the early 2000s, a coyote was actually spotted in the Hallett Nature Sanctuary, which is where this photo is taken from, coming from about 2006. Previously, during that time, the Hallett Nature Sanctuary was closed to the public, so there was no risk of running into this coyote elsewhere. We do see the story repeating itself, though, because around about 2019, during restoration of the Belvedere Castle area around the Great Lawn or Mid-Park area, we do see a coyote hanging around the construction zone in an area that was fenced off and blocked off to the public. We do believe that there is still at least one coyote in the park. And it's a reminder that parks like this, even though they are human created, do serve as a really real ecosystem that functions properly and supports a whole host of different wildlife. So you might not see a coyote in the park, but you may. It's a gentle reminder to keep your dogs on leash and to remember that, again, even though this is a human created landscape, it still is very wild in nature. As we make our way a little bit towards the west, we'll wander a little bit around and head to a landscape we may be pretty familiar with. Speaking of animals in the park, as we make our way over to this very famous meadow, known as Sheep Meadow, we can enjoy this recently opened landscape. It did open back up to the public around early April, allowing for all those spring breakers this week to enjoy it. And of course, anybody that can make it out to the park to enjoy a beautiful, restful, relaxing area. As we look over this area, we can recall its original name, the Green, probably for pretty obvious reasons as we see this view with an ample amount of different flora and green sights to behold. But as many of us may know, it has the name Sheep Meadow today to relate back to its early history of housing flocks of sheep. Dorset and Southdown sheep were stored on this meadow. And this is certainly not an April Fool's joke, as these photos are true and authentic. The Dorset and Southdown sheep would hang out on Sheep Meadow, helping to cut the grass as well as fertilize it, taking up residence in the nearby Tavern on the Green, initially created as a sheepfold back in 1871 and later converted into a dining restaurant. We do see this area, again, having a really naturalistic type of almost zoo feeling to it, as people could come over here and maybe not picnic, but look over the long, expansive meadow and see these sheep grazing and enjoying themselves. Very relaxing and very meditative in a way to see these types of sights. We do eventually see these sheep taking up residence elsewhere, being sent to Prospect Park in 1934. But as many of you may know, we at the Central Park Conservancy, we really aim to keep traditions alive. And we want to represent the park as it was as much as we can today. So in order to bring back a traditional element to Sheep Meadow, we are going to be closing it off to the public and reintroducing sheep onto this meadow. We've been experimenting this past week, as you can see with the photo here, and the sheep have really taken to this about 30-acre landscape, really enjoying all of the fresh grass to behold and to feast upon. April Fools, some of you may remember that this is actually a doctored photo that we shared last year during April Fools. This sheep photo, unfortunately, is not real. It is a digital image created by one of our employees, Jessica DeAngelis, but a very fun and fitting image to see sheep grazing on a 21st century meadow. Maybe one day we'll see sheep returning to the park. You can find some actually over in the Arsenal building area down near the Children's Petting Zoo area. But of course, maybe one day we'll see sheep returning to this meadow to graze. As we make our way a little bit past Sheep Meadow, we're going to head south now and head down to another landscape as we complete this little walking portion of our tour. Now, as we head down, we'll make our way south, passing buildings like the dairy. It did serve milk at one point, although you would never find cows there. You can find a cow, though, over at that children's zoo I just recently mentioned. But as we walk past the dairy, we'll head a little bit south and go to a feature that isn't really in use right now as we progress from winter into the spring season. But as we come down, we can talk a little bit about how the park has changed a lot over the years. Now, we do see recreation becoming especially popular throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. But even in the early park designs, there were spaces included for various recreation, primarily using fields. But of course, activities change over time. We see baseball becoming popular in the 20th century, and then later in the 20th century, sports like handball becoming very popular. Handball was made very popular because of its accessibility. All it requires is a ball and a wall. So very easy to play throughout just about any borough around New York City. We see handball courts being added to various areas of New York City, like here in Central Park at the North Meadow Recreation Center. Now, these fields are really important, and we see them being used today for something a little bit different than handball. Often today, we can see pickleball occurring over here very regularly. Now, pickleball has really expanded and grew in popularity tremendously over the past few years. As of February 2023, the National Pickleball Association, I believe they might be called something a little different, has estimated that there's about 10,320 pickleball courts throughout the United States of America. And soon there will be some more. Now, here we can see a photo of Woolman Rink, a famous ice skating rink that would open around 1954 and help to continue the traditional activity of ice skating in the park. Ice skating was immensely popular during the early days of Central Park and brought tremendous crowds here to enjoy the beautiful recreational activity. However, we've seen those numbers dwindle severely over the past 5 years. And because of that, we see the New York City Parks Department and the Central Park Conservancy reaching the conclusion to remove Woolman Rink. Instead, we are going to replace this with something that people can actually utilize more. So we did see just last week construction beginning on the deconstruction and removal of Woolman Rink. This rink is almost entirely removed, as we can see from the photo here. And in the coming weeks, we will see by summer, planned for August 2023, the opening of pickleball courts here in the previously occupied Woolman Rink area. April Fools, well, only sort of. The construction you see here is not a deconstruction or annihilation of Woolman Rink. This is rather Lasker Pool and Rink, which is undergoing a planned reconstruction process, one that should be completed by next summer of 2024. But what we can see that is true in this story is this rendering. While Woolman Rink will still remain an ice skating rink throughout the winter months, this summer it's going to change up a little bit, and it's going to be operated by City Pickle, which is going to be installing about a dozen or so pickleball courts in this area that can be rented out. I believe prices are about $80 for a rental, and paddles cost you about $6 or so. But we will see this adding a lot more opportunity for pickleball players to utilize Central Park as a playing landscape. Once again, the joke here is that Woolman Rink is not being deconstructed. Woolman Rink is still remaining around for ice skating throughout the winter months. And we're just seeing the City Pickle organization operating here during the summer months at the moment. That's something to be on the lookout for here in Central Park. I hope I didn't throw too many people off with those little bit of jokes and fabricated stories. Of course, some authentic stories mixed in there. But as we come towards the end of our walk, I want to add a little guessing game to the mix. This little guessing game is going to basically just compare different areas of, or different Olmsted and or Vox created parks and landscapes throughout the United States. So simply for this, we're going to have you guess if you think it's Central Park or a different landscape. We're going to be bringing up some polls in just a moment. So let's start off with something maybe sort of easy. With this photo, I'm going to launch a poll right now. And I want to hear if you think if this is the boathouse in Central Park, the boathouse in Prospect Park, or the boathouse in Clove Lakes Park, Staten Island. So I'll give everybody just a moment or two to vote in this, and then I'll share the results, and we can see if you got it right or not. I will mention that a couple parks have had boathouses, and the boathouses have switched locations. So the boathouse that you'll find in Central Park today is not in the same location that it once was. It changed up just a little bit. Maybe that'll help you, or maybe that'll throw you off a little bit. All right. So I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. And it looks like we have about 59% of people thinking that this is Central Park's boathouse, 28% think it's Prospect Park, and 14% think it's Clove Lakes Park in Staten Island. Ready? The result is Prospect Park, another park created by Vaux and Olmsted, beginning around about 1865 and finished by about the 1870s to early 1880s. Although we do see some similar comparisons here, one thing you might notice is that bridge in the background. It kind of looks like Bow Bridge, but it's actually a very different bridge that we can see here. Of course, being designed by the same creators, the boathouses in both Prospect Park and Central Park look a little similar. So once again, here the photo we're looking at is the Prospect Park boathouse. We can actually see an example of Central Park's boathouse here, being a two-story wooden deck creation designed by park creators Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. And of course, rowboating is still in operation today. Let's move on to our next little guess. So for this one, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to guess if we think that this is a water and woodland photo from Morningside Park, from Flushing Meadows in Queens, or from Central Park. So everybody take your vote in this one. Now this one's going to be pretty challenging. There's not a whole lot to go by. Might look like we have a little bit of architecture sticking around that back left corner, but otherwise it's a little bit vague of a picture. So good luck with this one. This one is a little bit trickier than that previous image we just had up. I'll give everybody just one more moment to vote in this. I'll be ending the results now. So I can see that we have about 60% guessing Central Park, 23% with Flushing Meadows, and 17% with Morningside Park. Now, some of these are a little tricky, and this is one of them. This is actually an image of Morningside Park, believe it or not. Morningside Park, another location created by Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, having a lot of the similar elements we see in Central Park. A lot of that Manhattan schist, a diversity of trees producing a lot of beautiful colors, and some of our favorite weeping willows to find along water bodies. Plus, of course, plenty of wildlife like the mallards on the bottom right corner. Here we can see a comparable shot of the pond in Central Park. You'll also notice on some of the captions, I did not put what park it is because I don't want you to just read the citation on the bottom. We can see a lot of similarities between Morningside Park, which features tremendous rock outcroppings of Manhattan schist. Moving along, let's guess on this one. Do we think that this is going to be, oops, sorry. There we are. Do we think that this is going to be rustic architecture found in Prospect Park, Andrew Jackson Downing Jr. Park up in Newburgh, New York, or Central Park? Give everybody just a moment to vote in this one. Now, rustic architecture is something we can see in many, many different areas, many different parks. It's very common now in North America and through park rustic architecture. However, it wasn't prior to the creation really of Central Park. So as we end this poll, we will learn that the majority of the people got this one right. The first true Central Park answer here. This is Central Park. This is actually in a location kind of nearby the Conservatory Garden today. We'll find a lot of these different types of pergolas and walks having existed throughout the park, with a couple hundred different summer houses, benches, beehives, and other rustic pieces of architecture being created. This is something we can see common in many parks, including Prospect Park, which we can see in this photo here. We see rustic architecture largely becoming popular thanks to Andrew Jackson Downing Jr., who was really the person, the landscape architect who taught Calvert Vaux. We see Andrew Jackson Downing Jr. really popularizing rustic architecture here in North America during the 1800s. Prior to that, it was pretty popular over in Europe, but he helped to really make it a very common thing here, and we see several parks featuring it. You might also notice I included Andrew Jackson Downing Jr. Park up in Newburgh, New York, a park created by Calvert Vaux in honor of his mentor, Andrew Jackson Downing Jr., who unfortunately died before he was able to submit a design for Central Park. All right, last little guess that we have here. So for this one, this is going to be another rustic architecture related one. Do we think that this is Central Park or not? Do we think it's Central Park, the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, as well as a few others, or Mohonk Mountain House up in New Paltz, New York? Might notice that a few of these were jumping farther out of New York, getting to either upstate regions or different states altogether. As I give you just one more moment, I'll close the results. And I see this one looks like a lot of people are voting for primarily one answer. And that answer that about 79% of us have voted for is the correct answer. What you're seeing here is Mohonk Mountain House Preserve up on the Mohonk Preserve area up near New Paltz, New York. You might be wondering, why does this have a connection to Central Park? Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted had nothing to do with this area. And there is one connection to Central Park. This area has arguably the largest collection of rustic outdoor architecture in North America. And we at the Central Park Conservancy have a lot of really beautiful rustic architecture here. This was a traditional element in the park's design, as we see Calvert Vaux including a lot of summer houses like this Dean summer house pictured here throughout the park, offering visitors beautiful architecture that's more fitting in a natural landscape, and also just beautiful in its somewhat geometric, but also wild growing designs. We have a rustic crew that formed back in the 1980s when the Conservancy formed initially. This rustic crew, as you might have guessed, being in charge of creating the rustic architecture here in Central Park. That early rustic crew that formed in the 1980s was able to study with the artisans of Mohonk Mountain House, who instilled some of the skills that they utilize in constructing rustic architecture. Today, these skills are passed down from rustic crew to new rustic crew members, and we see them really completing all of these beautiful constructions you'll see in the park, beyond bridges and summer houses, also benches and small little fencing throughout. We're actually seeing the recreation of a major wooden feature in the park coming to be presently. If you do visit near the Dairy Visitor Center, you'll see Chess and Checkers building, which opened in the mid-20th century, undergoing a restoration project. That project is not only including fixing up the building, but bringing back to life part of the once existent Kinderberg, or the large wooden structure that existed there. The photos that we see here are showing the largest wooden structure that ever existed in the park, the Kinderberg, which is German for Child's Play Mountain. This area served a lot of fun, rest and relaxation, and we're seeing a skeleton of it being brought back with the restoration work of Chess and Checkers. This project is undergoing, and our rustic team, along with other contractors, have been putting in a lot of work to bring back to life that circular pavilion made of wood that we see up top. This is a rendering, so it does look a little bit different, but the new pergola that is being placed up there is much more fitting with the rustic architecture we can see in photos like that earlier Dean summer house I shared. So this is a reminder that Central Park is constantly in progress, and there's a lot of original creations still coming back to the park. And as you might have guessed, this is not an April Fool's joke, but this is true and authentic. So we do encourage you to visit the Chess and Checkers building, which will be finishing up its restoration relatively soon, I believe opening up by the summer. I will have my colleagues share an article or a little website information about the Chess and Checkers restoration project for anybody that would like to learn a little bit more. But as we come to the end of our walk, I apologize for going a bit over our time, but I hope you enjoyed this little April Fool's walk where we learned a few fabricated stories, but also plenty of real information relating here to the park. As we do come to the end of our walk again, check the chat box to learn more about the projects like Chess and restoration, or check our website to find other types of programs, both virtual and in person, that you can join us on. We're really happy to continue to have your support here in the park. And we will leave this open for a little bit longer in case there's any last minute questions that we can answer on here. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. And from all of us here at Central Park Conservancy, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody.